What's up? I'm Kaniki, a chick with opinions. Go ahead and subscribe, like, and share this video. Thank you. Today I want to talk about policing in America. More specifically, policing of black bodies in America. In light of the recent brutal beating and murder of Tyree Nichols, I thought it was a really good conversation to continue. So when I hear people like Tucker Carlson say that because it was black police officers, it has nothing to do with racism, I feel it can be the furthest thing from the truth. First of all, we need to come to terms with racism in America and call it for what it is. And there's a difference between racism and prejudice. Racism incorporates prejudice, discrimination by an individual or community or even institution against people on the basis of their race and or ethnicity. And this tends to be people that are marginalized. Racism has social, political, and economic implications. Prejudice is just like, I don't like this person or that group of people because that's your own personal situation. So there is a difference between racism. Racism is an institution. What I want to look at today is how racism is incorporated in policing in America. So let's just talk about the beginning of America. So America, people were coming over here, fleeing, religious persecution and just to have a better life. Well, the colonies were being settled and at first they were small. And so a constable was all they needed. The earliest constable was documented in Plymouth in 1632. Constables were the original, form of policing in America. They date back to Plymouth in 1632. And basically what constables could do were a myriad of things, from marrying individuals to keeping the peace. They could appoint watchmen for the community. And what the watchmen would do is actually they would report to duty around 9, 10 o'clock at night and keep a lookout for nefarious things going on in the community. During those times, you couldn't be out on the streets after around 9 and 10 o'clock at night. So watchmen were making sure that, no one was out on the street, that fires didn't break out, that Indians didn't attack the colonists. So things of that nature is what watchmen did. As the colonies grew, however, a more uniform policing was needed. We began to see immigrants from Germany and Ireland settle into the colonies, and they started clashing with the current inhabitants that were typically from England and the Netherlands. And this was in particular cities like Boston. Of course, it was a port city. Cities like New York, they were growing, and so a more formalized policing needed to take place between the 1820s and 1860s. Because of more and more people coming, there was an increase in crime, and the night watchmen just could not handle it. So the first official police force was established in Boston in 1838. Then in 1845, New York established one, followed by Chicago, New Orleans, and Cincinnati. By the 1880s, almost every major city in the United States had a more formal police force. See, Boston was a shipping and commercial center, so the businessmen of that area wanted to protect their property, their goods. And so what they would do is hire people to do that. And they thought it was a good idea to actually put this cost on the city for the collective good. It was for the good of everyone to protect their property. And so that's how these formalized police forces kind of came into being. Likewise, in the South, Slave owners wanted to protect their property. It's just that in the South, property was slaves. And so in the South, that gave way to slave patrols. Slave patrols had the power to pursue, apprehend, and return runaways. The earliest slave patrols were in the Carolinas in the early to mid 1700s. And this consisted of men riding on horseback, carrying whips, rope, and sometimes even guns. They were there to keep slave rebellions suppressed. They were there to invoke fear in the slaves to prevent them from running away. They could stop slaves and check them for passes. If a slave was going into the market, they needed to have a pass to travel, so they could stop the slaves, check them for passes. They made sure that slaves were not gathering illegally. It was a fear that when a number of slaves gathered, that they were, planning a rebellion or insurrection or something of that manner. So slave patrols were there to offset that. They could search slave quarters looking for writings, because during that time, it was against the law for a slave to be able to read and write. They were looking for material. They could look for materials, weapons, and stolen goods. So the slave patrols went on and became more active during the Civil War. As a matter of fact, an example of this was in Georgia, where patrols were authorized to arrest any blacks who were on the street after 9 p.m. Also, they could not gather unless they were in the presence of a patroller or a police officer. So slave patrols, like I said, they were there to keep slaves in check through fear, through terror, whatever means. That's what they were there for. Eventually, slave patrols gave way to the Ku Klux Klan, which Ku Klux Klan actually means, Ku Klux means maltreat or terrorize. And Klan, of course, is a large organization. And so basically, Ku Klux Klan means an organization whose purpose is to maltreat or terrorize. So I'm sure there's no coincidence as to why the Ku Klux Klan came up with that name, but I digress. So basically, these slave patrols went on until pretty much the North won the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, of course, much of the South was a military state. But let's look into how policing in the antebellum South as slave patrols and policing now have a direct correlation. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the southern states that conceded on January 1st, 1863. And it reads that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious areas are henceforth shall be free. So all slaves were not free, just those in those southern states that conceded during the Civil War. It wasn't until the 13th Amendment that all people became free. And basically, I want to read the 13th Amendment because it is so important as to historical policing of Black bodies and current policing of Black bodies. So let's read this first section. And just for historical reference, the 13th Amendment was passed by the Senate on April 8th, 1864, and passed by the House on January 31st, my birthday, 1865. Section 1 reads like this: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except is a very important word, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the U.S. or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And the second part, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So basically what the 13th Amendment says, that slavery is illegal except as punishable by a crime. Now, that directly relates to policing of Black bodies in the United States, especially in the South, but in the United States. Because basically what that said was Black people are free and we can't force them to work for free. They are not subjects. They are not property. They are people. They are a freed people. But through punishment of a crime. So the 13th Amendment was passed January 31st, 1865, and then vagrancy laws, or the Vagrancy Act of 1866 was passed. Did you catch that? 13th Amendment passed in January of 1865, and the Vagrancy Act was passed in 1866. That was a direct finger to the Emancipation Proclamation. The Southern states was giving the United States a finger. So basically, the Southern states, in this chick opinion, was saying, oh, they're free, but for conviction of a crime, so let's give them a crime that we can convict them of. So let me read the Vagrancy Act, what it says. It says basically that you can lock up, you can convict someone, any person who appeared to be unemployed or homeless. So now you just freed slaves who are looking for work and perhaps even looking for a family member that is estranged. But if they appear to be homeless or appear to be jobless, they can be legally enslaved again. And oftentimes when this took place, they were forced to work in chain gangs on the plantations that they were just recently freed from. I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. How that directly relates to policing now in America. Because Black bodies were not important then. And to some degree, Black bodies, Black lives are still not important in America. Because when you think about it, even then, according to the law, before the emancipation, Black people weren't important other than for representation of white people, white slave owners in Congress. That's historical. 3/5 compromise. Black bodies counted for 3/5 of a person in order to gain representation in Congress. Otherwise, we were property. Black people, Black slaves were property. Let's bring it back to current. So the people that enforced these vagrancy laws were oftentimes the people, old ex-slave owners, were oftentimes the overseers that maintained the slaves. Oftentimes they were the slave patrol during the Civil War and pre-Civil War era. So these same people now have the ability to enforce vagrancy laws in the South. So they had the right, and after the war, arrests, and with the passing of these vagrancy laws, arrests grew, mostly Black people. Cities that didn't have police forces had to establish them quickly because of the number of people they were arresting. Cities like Atlanta, Augusta, Nashville, Richmond, and Memphis. Yeah. So there's a direct correlation with policing of Black bodies in the antebellum South, in the Reconstruction South, in the Jim Crow South, and in current day. There's a direct correlation with policing. And until we recognize and accept it, we can't move forward. So it's my hope that on today, I've shed some light historically about policing, which will make people want to act about policing today. We need to pass the George Floyd in Policing Act. It needs to pass today. I need you all to call your local congressman, to march, to do whatever we need to do to get this act passed, because the brutality against Black bodies, regardless of the color of the police officer's skin, because when you think about it, even in the case of George Floyd, there was an Asian cop, there was a mixed race cop, mixed race with Black, and there was a white cop. All of them failed George Floyd because that blue code goes deeper than that skin code. So it doesn't matter what color the police officer is. What matters is the color of that body. And Black bodies tend to get, I'll even back up further. Black, minority, poor bodies tend to get the brunt of force in policing. And I'm not saying that all police officers are bad, because I know they're not. I have had police officers that have been instrumental in my life in helping me. I have 2 sons, in helping with my sons. So I'm definitely not saying all police are bad. I'm saying that one bad apple spoils the bunch. That's all I'm saying. And until we recognize where we came from, we can't go do anything about where we're going. So I need America to accept that policing in the United States, especially in the South, has a direct correlation with the slave patrols of the antebellum South. And I need, once that light bulb clicks, for us to move forward in getting the George Floyd Act in policing passed. We need that passed. We need a centralized system that if a cop gets fired for abusing his power, it goes into a national database and he could never hold an office again. We need a national ban on chokeholds. We need things like this in place so that people can stop overstepping the limits. These are just my opinions, because I'm a chick with a whole lot of opinions. I'm Kaniki. And remember, it's not an attitude, it's a movement. Peace.